The sun beat down on the wide stone plaza, hot and unrelenting. It was the kind of afternoon that made the air shimmer above the pavement, blurring the sharp edges of the buildings. In the center of the city, life moved at a frantic pace. People rushed by with heads down, eyes glued to phone screens or fixed on some distant point in the sky, their minds already miles away from where their feet were actually stepping. They were important people with important jobs, dressed in stiff suits and bright colors, carrying the smell of expensive coffee and dry cleaning with them. They walked in tight lines, flowing like a river around anything that got in their way. Ilara sat on the edge of the large concrete planter box near the fountain. She was a stone in the middle of that river. The people flowed around her without stopping, their eyes sliding right over her, as if she were part of the architecture. To them, she was just a lump of old clothes taking up space on a bench. To Ilara, the world felt very large and very loud. She pulled her knees tighter against her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. The movement caused a sharp pain in her stomach, a deep, hollow cramp that made her flinch. It had been a long time since she had last eaten. She couldn't remember exactly when the last meal was, maybe a day ago, maybe 2. Time had become a blurry thing lately, measured only by the growing ache in her belly and the changing position of the sun. Her coat was too thin for the season, offering little protection against the bite of the wind or the heat of the sun. It was gray and frayed at the cuffs, a hand-me-down that had seen better days long before it reached her. Underneath it, her arms felt thin and weak, but she hugged herself tight to preserve whatever body heat she had left. Just across the plaza, there was a place that smelled like heaven. It was a restaurant with tables set outside on the sidewalk, covered in crisp white tablecloths that fluttered in the breeze. A large blackboard stood on an easel near the entrance, written in curly, fancy gold letters that Ilara could barely read. But she didn't need to read to understand. She could smell it. The air was thick with the scent of roasting garlic, butter that had just melted, fresh bread that was soft and warm, and herbs she couldn't name but desperately wanted to taste. Every time the breeze blew toward her, Ilara's mouth would water, but her stomach would twist in protest. It was a cruel trick of nature. The smell of the food was so strong it felt like a weight on her chest. She watched the waiters moving between the tables. They wore white aprons and moved with a kind of easy grace, balancing silver trays high above their heads. On those trays were plates of food that looked bigger than anything Ilara had seen in months. There were steaming bowls of soup, sandwiches stacked high with meat, and glasses of water with ice clinking inside them. Ilara stared at a glass of water on a corner table. It looked so clear, so cold. Her throat felt like it was full of dust. She watched a woman in a blue dress laugh at something a man across her said, then pick up a fork and eat a bite of something green and fresh. The woman didn't even look like she enjoyed it. She just ate it because it was there. Ilara would have given anything to sit in that chair, just for 5 minutes, to feel full. She looked down at her own hands. They were resting on her knees, clenched into small fists. Her fingernails were dirty, the edges rimmed with dark grime that wouldn't scrub off no matter how hard she tried with the cold water in public restrooms. She rubbed her thumb over her knuckles, feeling the rough skin. She felt out of place here. Even the pigeons that strutted around the crumbs under the tables looked healthier than she felt. They had feathers that gleamed in the sunlight. Ilara just felt gray. A group of young people walked past her spot on the planter. They were holding icy drinks in colorful plastic cups, laughing loudly about a party they had gone to the night before. "Did you see him?" One of them shrieked, nearly spilling her drink. He was hilarious. They didn't look at Ilara. They didn't see the girl watching them with tired eyes. They just walked past, a swirl of bright colors and loud voices, leaving behind a faint scent of sweet, sugary syrup. Ilara stayed perfectly still. She had learned that staying still was the best way to avoid trouble. If she moved too much, people looked at her. If she asked for things, people got angry. She had seen the way shopkeepers would wave their hands and shout, their faces turning red, telling kids like her to move along, to stop scaring the customers. So she just watched. She was an expert at watching. She saw the way a mother wiped her son's face with a napkin, gentle and patient. She saw the way an old man held the door open for a stranger with a smile. There was so much kindness in this city, but it seemed to bounce off her like an invisible shield. The kindness was for everyone else. The pain in her stomach flared up again, sharper this time. Ilera winced and shifted her weight. She knew she couldn't sit there forever. She needed to do something. The problem was, she didn't have anything. She didn't have money. She didn't have parents waiting for her at home. She didn't have a phone to call for help. All she had was a coat on her back and a desperate, burning need for just one bite of something that would stop the hurting. She looked back at the restaurant. The Gourmet Bistro, the sign said. She looked at the people eating. They looked so happy, so normal. They didn't know what it felt like to have your stomach eat itself. They didn't know what it felt like to be invisible. Ilera took a deep breath. The air smelled of car exhaust and perfume, but underneath it, that smell of butter and bread still lingered. She felt a lump forming in her throat, but she swallowed it down. Crying didn't help. Crying just gave you a headache and made your face sticky. She had to be smart. She had to find a way to get their attention without making them angry. She needed a reason for them to look at her, really look at her, and see a human being instead of a problem. She slowly uncurled her legs. They felt stiff and numb. She placed her feet on the pavement, feeling the hardness of the ground through the thin soles of her shoes. She stood up. For a second, the world spun a little, black spots dancing in her vision from standing up too fast. She grabbed the edge of the planter to steady herself. When the dizziness passed, she smoothed down the front of her coat. It was a useless gesture. The fabric was wrinkled and stained, but it made her feel a little more prepared, a little more dignified. She looked across the plaza at the busy restaurant. It felt like a vast ocean she had to cross. The distance between the planter and the white tablecloths was the most dangerous distance in the world to her right now. If she walked over there and they said no, she didn't know if she would have the strength to walk away. But the pain in her stomach was louder than the fear in her heart. She took a step forward, then another. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kept her head down, watching her dirty sneakers hit the pavement one after the other. She wasn't just a beggar asking for a handout. She was a girl with a talent that no one could see yet. She just needed them to listen for 1 minute. Ilera moved toward the entrance of the bistro, leaving her safe spot on the stone planter behind her. The noise of the city seemed to fade away as she focused on the glass doors and the people sitting just beyond them. This was it, the moment of truth. She had nothing to lose but her hunger. The short walk from the edge of the plaza to the restaurant felt like the longest journey Ilera had ever taken. With every step, her shoes slapped softly against the pavement, but in her ears, the sound was as loud as a drum. She could feel the eyes of the people passing her, but she knew they weren't really looking at her. They were looking through her, seeing a shadow, a nuisance, something to be avoided. But she kept walking, her chin tucked down toward her chest, her hands balled into tight fists inside her coat pockets to stop them from shaking. As she got closer to the outdoor seating area, the noise changed. The roar of the traffic faded into the background, replaced by the clinking of silverware against ceramic plates and the low, happy hum of conversation. The aroma of food hit her like a physical wall. It was so strong it made her head spin. There was a sharp tang of vinegar, the rich smell of grilled meat, and the sweet scent of cakes sitting on a display stand inside. Ilera swallowed hard, forcing her mouth to stay shut. She couldn't let herself look like a starving animal, even if that was exactly how she felt. She had to hold on to the last bit of pride she had left. She stopped near the velvet rope that separated the dining area from the sidewalk. A tall man in a crisp black apron was standing there, folding napkins with quick, practiced movements. This was the manager. He looked like he owned the pavement, his chest puffed out, his eyes constantly scanning the tables to make sure everything was perfect. He looked busy. He looked important. He looked like the kind of person who had never missed a meal in his entire life. Ilera stood still for a moment, gathering her courage. Her heart was beating so hard she thought it might burst right out her chest. She knew what people saw when they looked at her. They saw dirt. They saw trouble. They saw someone who didn't belong in their world of white tablecloths and crystal glasses. But underneath the dirt and the old coat, she had something else. She had a fire inside her that had nothing to do with food. It was the only thing she had left to trade. She took a shaky breath and stepped off the curb and onto the flat mats laid out for the diners. The manager looked up, his eyebrows snapping together the moment he saw her. He didn't see a child. He saw a problem walking toward him. "Excuse me, sir," Elara said. Her voice came out as a whisper, cracked and dry from not having enough water. The manager stopped folding napkins. He frowned, looking her up and down with a look that made Elara want to shrink into the ground. He didn't say anything, just waited for her to leave, waving a hand slightly as if he was shooing away a fly. Elara didn't move. She dug her fingernails into her palms and tried to make her voice stronger. I can see you have many guests. I don't want money." She paused, glancing nervously at the people sitting at the nearest tables. They were starting to look over now. She could feel their gaze landing on her, heavy and judging. "Can I play for a piece of food?" For a second, there was silence. The manager looked confused. He looked around her as if expecting to see a guitar case or a speaker, but her hands were empty. "Play?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Play what?" Elara pointed a trembling finger toward the old piano tucked against the glass wall of the restaurant. It was a dark, polished instrument that mostly sat there as decoration, waiting for the weekend musicians. "I play the piano," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Just a song, in exchange for a plate. Anything." The manager let out a short, sharp huff of air that was almost a laugh. "You!" He looked at her grimy hands, her torn coat, her messy hair. The idea was ridiculous to him. At a table just a few feet away, a man in a sharp gray suit put down his coffee cup. He turned in his chair to look at her. He had a loud, booming voice that carried across the tables. "Did I hear that right?" he asked, looking at his friends with a wide grin. "The little urchin wants to play music?" A few of the people at his table chuckled. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was a laugh people make when they feel superior, when they see someone they think is acting above their station. "She has no instrument," the manager said, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked tired now, impatient. "I don't need one," Elara said quickly. "You have one. Right there." The man in the gray suit laughed louder, throwing his head back. "Oh, this is rich," he exclaimed, wiping a fake tear from his eye. "A street musician without a street corner." He looked directly at Elara, his eyes cold and amused. "What are you going to do, little girl? Bang on the lid with your fists." A ripple of laughter went through the nearby tables. It was a cruel sound. It wasn't a laughter of joy. It was a laughter of mockery. It bounced off the walls and hit Elara in the chest. Her face burned hot with shame. She could feel the tears stinging the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away rapidly. She couldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of them. "I play very well," Elara insisted, though her voice was shaking. "Please, just one song. I am very hungry." The manager shook his head, his lip curling in disgust. "This is a respectable place," he said sternly. "We don't need beggars, scaring the customers. Go on. Get out of here." He pointed a finger toward the street, commanded her to leave. Elara stood her ground, but her legs felt like lead. The hunger gnawed at her insides, sharp and relentless. She looked at the manager, pleading with her eyes. She wasn't trying to be rude. She wasn't trying to ruin their lunch. She just wanted to survive. She wanted to show them that she wasn't just a piece of trash on the street. The humiliation washed over her in waves. Every pair of eyes in the outdoor section was on her now. They were staring at the dirty girl, making a scene. They were looking at her stained coat and her worn-out shoes. They were judging her, finding her guilty of the crime of being poor and hungry. The man in the gray suit took a sip of his coffee, smirking at her over the rim of the cup, as if this was the best entertainment he had seen all day. "Go on," the manager said again, taking a step toward her. He was going to force her to leave. He was going to put his hands on her and push her back onto the sidewalk where she belonged. Elara looked down at her feet. She felt small. She felt worthless. The laughter echoed in her ears, drowning out the sounds of the city. It seemed like the whole world was laughing at her, telling her that she was nothing, that she would never be anything, that she didn't deserve a seat at the table. She had tried to be brave. She had tried to ask for help in a dignified way, and this was what she got for it. She squeezed her eyes shut for a brief second, waiting for the manager to grab her arm, waiting for the ordeal to be over. She felt the weight of their scorn pressing down on her shoulders. It was heavy and suffocating. She wished she could just disappear, turn into smoke, and float away from this place, away from the smell of the food she couldn't have, away from the people who hated her, without even knowing her name. The manager took another step, his shadow falling over her. "Don't make me call the police," he muttered, his voice low and threatening. Ilara flinched. She didn't want trouble. She didn't want to go to jail. She just wanted to eat. She took a stumbling step backward, her heel catching on the edge of the carpet. She felt the balance leaving her. It was over. She had lost. The laughter of the man in the gray suit rang in her ears, confirming what she always feared. She was invisible, and she was worthless. Just as she was about to turn and run back to the cold stone planter, a voice cut through the noise. It was a woman's voice, sharp and clear, but not unkind. It sliced through the laughter and command to the manager like a knife through soft butter. "Wait a minute." The chatter died down instantly. Ilara froze, her hand still half raised to shield her face. She looked toward the sound of the voice. The voice came from a small, round table in the far corner of the patio, tucked partly in the shade of a large decorative tree. An elderly woman sat there alone. She was dressed simply but neatly, with a lace shawl draped over her shoulders despite the warmth of the day. She had stopped eating, her fork resting on the edge of her plate, and was now looking directly at the scene unfolding near the entrance. Her face wasn't angry or amused like the others. It was set in a firm, serious expression. The manager turned toward her, his annoyed frown faltering for a split second. He recognized her. She was a regular here, a woman who came for tea and the quiet atmosphere, usually keeping to herself. He straightened his apron, tried to switch from his aggressive stance back to a polite service mode. "Madam," he said, his voice tight, "please don't worry. We are handling this. It's just a beggar. I will remove her immediately so you can enjoy your meal in peace." The man in the gray suit chuckled again, swirling his coffee. "Yes, let's not make a scene out of nothing. The girl is looking for a handout. It's a classic street trick." The elderly woman ignored the man in the suit completely. She kept her eyes locked on the manager. "I heard her ask," she said, her voice calm but carrying a surprising amount of strength. "She didn't ask for money. She asked to play." The manager sighed, gesturing dismissively toward Ilara. "Madam, look at her. She has no instrument. She is likely just trying to get close to the tables to steal a wallet or a tip. It happens all the time in the city." "Did she ask for money?" the woman repeated. She looked at Ilara, then really looked at her. For the first time, she saw the dirt on the girl's face and the fear in her eyes, but she also saw something else. She saw a child who was standing her ground even though she was terrified. "I asked you a question. Did she ask for money?" "No," the manager admitted, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "She asked to play the piano, in exchange for food." "Then let her play," the woman said simply. A murmur ran through the nearby tables. People leaned in, whispering to each other. The gray suit laughed again, louder this time. "Play what? The air? You want us to listen to a starving child bang on our furniture while we eat? It's absurd." The woman turned her gaze to the man in the suit. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold stare that silenced him immediately. "It is only absurd if we refuse to listen," she said sharply. She offered a trade, a service for a meal. That is how the world works, is it not? People work for what they need. She looked back at the manager. "If she plays, and she is terrible, then you may ask her to leave. But if she is lying, she will leave on her own because she will be embarrassed. But you cannot throw her out for offering to work." The manager looked at the old woman, then at the growing crowd of curious diners, and finally at Ilara. He didn't want to do it. He thought it was a waste of time and a disruption to his carefully controlled lunch service. But the old woman was a good customer, and he didn't want to fight. He let out a long, dramatic sigh that showed exactly how much he disliked the idea. "Fine," he snapped, turning back to Ilara. "One song. That is it. If you touch a wrong key, if you make a noise that bothers my guests, you are gone. Do you understand?" Ilara nodded quickly. She felt a small spark of hope ignite in her chest, pushing back the cold fear. "Yes, I understand. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," the manager grumbled. He pointed a finger at the old upright piano that stood against a glass wall of the restaurant, near where the old woman sat. It was usually just a prop, holding a small flower vase on top of it. It was polished and dark, looking heavy and expensive. "Go on." Ilera took a deep breath and walked toward the piano. It felt like walking to the edge of a cliff. The distance between the sidewalk and the instrument was only a few yards, but it felt like miles. Every eye in the restaurant was on her. The pressure of their stares was heavy, weighing down on her shoulders. She could hear the whispers. She saw the gray suit smirking at his companion, making a bet that she would fail. She reached the bench. It was made of smooth, shiny wood. Ilera hesitated. She looked down at her clothes. Her coat was covered in street dust. Her hands were stained with grime from the city. She felt a sudden, intense wave of shame. She didn't want to touch this beautiful instrument. She felt like she would contaminate it, like she would dirty something pure and clean just by being near it. She looked back at the manager, who was checking his watch, and the old woman, who was watching her patiently. The old woman gave her a small, encouraging nod. It was just a tiny movement of the head, but to Ilera, it felt like a push. She pulled her coat sleeves down over her hands, as far as they would go, try to cover her palms. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best she could do. She climbed onto the bench. It was a little too high for her, and her feet dangled above the pedals, but she didn't care. She shuffled forward until she was close enough. Ilera placed her hands hovering just above the keys, underneath the fabric of her sleeves. Her fingers were trembling. She could feel the tension radiating from the tables around her. The man in the gray suit had stopped eating. He was watching her, waiting for the joke, waiting for the disaster. The rest of the diners were paused, forks hovering in midair, waiting to see what would happen. The silence stretched out. It was heavy and thick. Ilera closed her eyes for a moment. She blocked out the smell of the food. She blocked out the fancy clothes and the judging faces. She thought back to a time before the hunger, a time when music was the only thing that mattered. She remembered how the notes felt, not just in her fingers, but in her soul. She remembered the peace that music gave her when the world was too loud and too mean. She wasn't here to prove the manager wrong. She wasn't here to impress the rude man in the suit. She was here to survive. And she was going to use the only gift she had left to do it. Ilera took a slow, steady breath to calm her racing heart. She let the air fill her lungs, then released it slowly. She opened her eyes. They were no longer filled with tears or fear. They were clear and focused. Her fingers lowered onto the ivory keys. They were cool and smooth under the fabric of her sleeves. She found a starting position, her hands instinctively knowing where to go even though it had been so long. She didn't start with a bang. She didn't try to show off with fast, loud notes to shock them. Instead, she pressed down gently. A single, clear note rang out, cutting through the outdoor noise like a bell. It was followed by another and then a soft chord. The sound was simple, but it was pure. It didn't sound like a street performance. It didn't sound like a child messing around. It sounded like music. The gray suit paused, his cup halfway to his lips. The manager stopped checking his watch. The chatter that had started to bubble up died down instantly. Ilera's hands moved across the keys, and as the melody began to unfold, the atmosphere on the patio shifted completely. The mockery in the air vanished, replaced by a sudden, surprised silence. The first few notes hung in the air, suspended like dust motes in a beam of light. They weren't random or clumsy. They were precise, clear as a bell. The sound that came out of that old, upright piano was not the banging of a toy or the hesitant plinking of a beginner. It was a voice, a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from a place much older and wiser than the small girl sitting on the bench. Ilera's hands moved across the keys. They were covered by the sleeves of her coat, but underneath, her fingers were dancing. At first, the melody was simple, a winding path of notes that felt like a question being asked. But then, her left hand shifted and the harmony changed. The music grew in depth, filling the space above the patio. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a story unfolding in real time. The effect on the restaurant was immediate and physical. The silence that fell over the patio was different from the one before. Before, the silence had been filled with tension and judgment, awaiting for her to fail. Now, the silence was heavy with awe. The clinking of silverware had stopped completely. The murmurs of conversation died out one by one as people turned in their chairs to stare at the source of the sound. The man in the gray suit froze with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. His smirk, which had been so firmly planted on his face just a moment ago, began to dissolve. He blinked, his eyes narrowing as if he couldn't believe his ears. He looked at the dirty coat, the messy hair, and then back at the flying hands. It didn't make sense to him. The math in his head, dirty clothes equaled dirty life, wasn't working anymore. Ilera was no longer in the restaurant. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly to the side as she listened to the music she was creating. She was thinking about the cold pavement she had slept on the night before, and she was pouring that chill into the lower notes, deep and melancholy. She was thinking about the sharp pain in her stomach, and it came out in the high, piercing trills that seemed to cut through the warm air. She was playing Chopin, a piece she had learned long ago from a memory she thought she had lost, but she was playing it her way. It was raw. It was unpolished in a technical sense, perhaps, but it was overflowing with emotion. It was the kind of music that reached inside a person and squeezed. It reminded the listening businessmen of the dreams they had given up years ago, to sit in offices and wear suits. It reminded the young couples of the fragility of happiness. It was a sound that stripped away the pretension of the expensive bistro. For a moment, nobody cared about the white tablecloths or the fancy gold writing on the menu. They were just human beings, listening to another human being pour her heart out. The waiter who had been ready to take an order stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, his notepad forgotten in his hand. He watched the girl's feet, which couldn't even reach the pedals, yet the music sounded as full and rich as if a whole orchestra were playing. The manager, who had been leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, slowly uncrossed them. His face went from impatient to confused, and then to something resembling shock. He looked at the old woman in the corner, but she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were closed, a small, peaceful smile playing on her lips as she let the music wash over her. The piece grew more intense. Ilera's hands moved faster, a blur of gray fabric against the black and white keys. The sound swelled, rising above the noise of the city traffic that hummed in the background. It was powerful. It demanded attention. It was angry and sad and beautiful all at the same time. A woman at a table near the piano put her hand over her mouth, her eyes welling up with tears. She didn't know why she was crying, exactly. Maybe it was the music, or maybe it was a sudden realization of how easily she had dismissed this girl just 10 minutes ago. She saw the genius in the dirty child, and it made her feel small. The man in the gray suit slowly lowered his cup. The coffee inside was cold now, but he didn't notice. He felt a strange lump forming in his own throat. He looked at the girl, really looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a beggar. He saw a master. He saw someone who had something he could never buy with all his money. The laughter from earlier felt like a stone sitting in his stomach now. He felt foolish. He felt a deep, stinging sense of shame for the cruel joke he had made. The music was weaving a spell over the plaza. People walking by on the sidewalk outside the velvet rope stopped in their tracks. They paused, carrying their shopping bags, turned to look for the source of the melody. When they saw it was just a street kid playing at a restaurant, their eyes widened in surprise. A small crowd began to gather on the edge of the patio, drawn in by the sound, blurring the line between the inside and the outside. The invisible barrier that the manager tried so hard to keep up was being dissolved by the music. Ilera's fingers were starting to ache, but she didn't stop. She didn't dare stop. She knew that when the music ended, the spell would break. The world would rush back in. The hunger would come back. The cold would come back. But for now, while she was playing, she was free. She was flying. She was heard. Every note that rang out was a scream of her existence, a declaration that she was here, that she mattered, that she had a soul just as deep and complex as anyone sitting at those tables. The melody wound its way toward the end, slowing down. The fierce storm of notes calmed into gentle, rolling waves. Ilera's touch became lighter, delicate as a feather. She pressed the final chords, a soft, resolution that echoed in the sudden quiet. She lifted her hands off the keys, resting them in her lap. The last note vibrated in the air, fading slowly until it was complete and total silence. Elara opened her eyes. She was panting slightly, her chest heaving with exertion. For a second, the world felt blurry. She looked at the keys, terrified of what she would see when she turned around. She expected them to be angry, that she had tricked them. She expected them to laugh and tell her to get lost. She waited for the shouting, but there was no shouting. The manager was standing still, his mouth slightly open. The waiter was looking at his hands, as if they belonged to someone else. The man in the gray suit was staring straight ahead, completely still. And the old woman in the corner slowly opened her eyes and began to clap. It started with just her. 2 hands coming together in a slow, rhythmic beat. Asterisk clap. 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 Asterisk. Then the woman with the tear-stained face joined in. Then the waiter. The sound spread like a ripple across the water. Within seconds, the entire patio was applauding. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't the bored clapping of people waiting for the next course. It was loud. It was enthusiastic. It was genuine. The man in the gray suit didn't clap at first. He just sat there, looking at his shoes, his face red. But then he took a deep breath, looked up at Elara with a look of pure respect, and brought his hands together. He applauded harder than anyone else. The sound washed over Elara, warm and unexpected. She sat there on the bench, her small hands folded in her lap, listening to the sound of strangers clapping for her. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The sound of the applause was like a warm tide washing over the cold stone of the plaza. It was a noise Elara had only ever heard from a distance, directed at people on stages or movies, never at her. For a long moment, she sat frozen on the piano bench, her hands resting in her lap, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She couldn't quite process that the sound was for her. The air felt different now. The sharp edges of judgment that had surrounded her earlier had melted away, leaving something soft and awestruck in their place. She looked up slowly. Her eyes scanned the faces of the people who, just minutes ago, had looked right through her or had laughed at her dirt. Now they were standing. Some were wiping tears from their eyes. Others were smiling with their mouths open in wonder. It was as if a spell had been broken, and they were finally seeing the girl who had been invisible in plain sight. A movement near the entrance caught her eye. The manager was moving, but he wasn't coming to grab her arm. He was walking quickly, his face pale and his expression complicated. He looked flustered, perhaps even a little ashamed, but there was a new light in his eyes. He signaled sharply to a waiter, who rushed over with a tray. Elara's heart skipped a beat as she watched them approach. Instinctively, she started to shrink back, bracing for the rejection, expecting them to tell her the song was nice, but she still had to leave. But the waiter didn't stop at the edge of the patio to shoo her away. He walked right up to the piano bench. On the tray was not a scrap of leftovers or a cold roll thrown out from the kitchen. It was a plate, a real white ceramic plate. On it sat a thick, juicy hamburger, oozing with melted cheese, and beside it, a generous pile of golden, crispy French fries. There was even a small mound of green salad and a glass of water with ice cubes clinking softly against the side. "Here," the waiter said gently. He didn't speak down to her. He set the tray down on top of the piano, right in front of her. "The chef, he heard you playing. He made this fresh, just for you." The smell hit Elara instantly. It was rich and savory, making her stomach lurch with a hunger so intense it almost hurt. She stared at the food, unable to believe it was real. It looked like something from a dream. "It's the least we can do," the manager said, standing a few feet back. He shuffled his feet, looking at the ground. I apologize for earlier. I didn't know." Elara looked at the food, then at the manager, and then back at the food. The applause was starting to die down, turning into a low, buzzing hum of conversation. People were whispering to each other, but they were looking at her with kindness now. She felt a lump form in her throat, thick and hard. She wanted to say something profound. She wanted to thank them for hearing her, but the words were stuck behind the lump of emotion. Finally, she just nodded. She slid off the bench, her feet touching the pavement again. She didn't start eating right there, standing up. Instead, she carefully picked up the heavy tray. It felt warm in her hands, a sharp contrast to the cold air around her. She turned to the table where the elderly woman sat. The woman was watching her, a soft, knowing smile on her face. She raised her teacup in a silent salute to Ilara. Ilara bowed her head slightly toward the woman. It was a small gesture, but it felt huge. It was a salute from one survivor to another. Then Ilara turned and walked away from the piano. She didn't walk toward the tables to bask in their praise. She didn't wait for the man in the gray suit to offer her money, which she saw him fumbling for his wallet as she turned. She didn't want their pity or their coins now. She had what she needed. She had the food. She walked across the patio. But the path was different now. The velvet rope that had separated the important people from the rest of the world felt like it had vanished. The waiters moved out of her way, not with annoyance, but with respect. The diners watched her go, many of them still silent, still processing the magic they had just witnessed. Ilara stepped off the restaurant mats and back onto the stone pavement of the plaza. The noise of the city rushed back in, the honking of cars, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant wail of the siren. But it didn't feel as harsh as it had before. It didn't feel like a wall she was banging against. It just felt like noise. Background noise to the music that was still playing in her head. She found her spot back at the planter box, the same cold stone ledge where she had been sitting before. She sat down and placed a tray on her lap. For a moment, she just looked at the burger. It was perfect. Steam was still rising from it, carrying the scent of salt and meat. She picked up a French fry with her fingers and put it in her mouth. The crunch was loud. The taste of salt and potato exploded on her tongue. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. It wasn't just food. It was fuel. It was life. She took a bite of the burger, the cheese and bread, and meat mixing together in a warm, comforting rush. With every bite, the pain in her stomach began to subside. The gnawing, twisting ache was replaced by a heavy, warm feeling of fullness. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up against the cold and the fear for so long, finally dropped. She relaxed. As she ate, she watched the world go by. People were still rushing past her, still looking at their phones, still ignoring the world around them. Nothing had really changed about the city. It was still a hard, busy place. But Ilara knew something they didn't. She knew that things could change in an instant. She looked down at her hands. They were still dirty. Her coat was still old and frayed. She was still the same girl she had been an hour ago. But inside, she felt taller. She felt a fire burning in her chest that no amount of cold wind could put out. She had a voice. She had proven that she was more than just a dirty face on the street. She had something to give, something that could make busy, important people stop and listen. Ilara finished the last bite of the burger and drank the water, the cold liquid soothing her dry throat. She sat there for a long time, letting the food settle, feeling the strength returning to her limbs. She looked back at the piano one last time. It was just a piece of furniture again, sitting silently against the glass wall, but she knew what lived inside it. She stood up, taking the empty tray to a nearby trash bin. As she walked away from the bistro, leaving the applause and the fancy table behind, she didn't walk with her head down, staring at her shoes. She walked with her head up. She didn't know where she was going to sleep that night, and she didn't know if she would eat tomorrow. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She walked down the street, her step a little lighter, her spirit a little brighter, carrying the music with her wherever she went.